What a remarkable day that we've had. In fact, what a remarkable 2 days that we've had. From that opening yesterday with that amazing talk on J-Man and Hopkins, to the Henry Vaughan that has wound it up. It seems to me that we've had a globe. There's been the entirety of trying to find out what we mean by this term, the Christian literary imagination. How did it manifest itself? In poetry, we haven't done very much in drama, and maybe somebody might want to talk about that a little bit, but how does it manifest itself? But what do we actually mean by it? And I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists, starting with Joe, because actually this whole idea came about through a conversation after a presentation with the Christian, which I think it was Rowan's on the Merchant of Venice, if I seem to remember. And so Rowan, you're the one who was responsible for this, and we were talking over dinner, Joe and myself, about the Christian literary imagination. So Joe, what do you think? How would you define the literary imagination, so that when everybody goes out, oh yeah, that's it. I've got it. I can do my A-level scripture now. Yeah.
Well, I see you're getting your pound of flesh at me, so that's good. I think this, for me, the Christian literary imagination, and this goes back to the first talk that we had back in October 2020, is not that everyone is talking about Jesus all the time, or even that, one of the characters is secretly the Savior. But that, to borrow from William Lynch, who's one of my Jesuit heroes, that the particularity, and that's a theme that's come up, the engaging with human particularity in concrete situations and passing through those rather than sidestepping, is the hallmark of a Christian vision of reality and engaging with reality. So exiting from God, going through the particulars of human experience and returning to God without sidestepping the trials and the tribulations and what things are difficult. And that literature is a particularly excellent way to do that, because you have time and space and ability to kind of wrestle with those questions. So to my mind, that's sort of, as an opening bid, what the Christian literary imagination is. And I think that's been well treated in different ways here, both yesterday and today.
What makes a literary creation relevant to or in conversation with the Christian tradition seems to me, first of all, to have to do with humanity in time, how humanity evolves, changes, is challenged, is transformed in time. Because we tell stories as Christians, and we tell stories about humanity evolving through that narrative process. And that narrative process is one in which loss is real but not final. And also, therefore, one in which transfiguration is real, but not in the sense of happy endings and ironing out the difficulties. So there is, I've argued this in print a bit, there is a role for the tragic in the literary imagination of a Christian, very definitely, quite centrally in some ways. But above all, it's for me to do with that self-discovery over time and grace working itself out in that temporal process and transforming from within, maybe. So looking back to the fundamental theological theme, which was touched on, I think, in a question earlier today, what is it to say that the Word is at the creative heart of absolutely everything?
Bonnie?
To write in such a way as to participate in God's creation.
That's all I've got.
Well done, well done.
Ditto. I feel rather intimidated up here among all these literary scholars, as a mere theologian, but it reminds me that doctrine, although some would say it's made up as this power thing to impose on others, but it's not that. It reflects and responds to and points to the reality of absence and presence, of failure and fragility and healing and hope and love. And theology is one way to look at that, but it can never, of course, be the only way. And the literary imagination is so capacious in bringing that forth. And the other thing, it reminds me of our dear friend John O'Malley, S.J., and his four cultures of the West, that it's the prophetic, it's the scholarly, it's the humanistic, and it's the arts. And they all have to work together, to name this, to describe this.
I think for me, I would, something that Timothy said this afternoon reminded me of the paper I gave earlier in the series, in the heart of lockdown, about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and the idea of transformative conversation. I think at the heart of the Christian literary imagination is the idea of transformative conversation that can enact change. So at the end of it, the end of these, whether it's a poem or a novel or a play or whatever it is, there's a fusion of theology and literature, and at the end, the outcome is something transformative for the audience, the reader, but also for the person creating that piece of literature as well.
Thank you.
That was great.
Okay, so when Mike told us we were going to do this, he said we could only say one sentence.
Oh, you didn't tell me that.
Maybe he only told me that. Right. So I
Yeah, so the Christian literary imagination is lead people along a little bit there.
So, as I said earlier, I tend to figure out what I'm thinking through writing. So I wrote a sentence, but I think I'll just paraphrase it. And it's that, you know, in the Western tradition is so committed to renewal, creation, recreation, revision, right, and creativity. And I think that in not just literary, but all sorts of creative pursuits, as we're creating, we're necessarily interpreting that through these very powerful Christian stories of renewal and creation. So for me, that's the Christian literary tradition. It's one of creation that's always connected back to the stories of creation, one of renewal that's always connected back to the renewal that Christ represents. So there.
Michael didn't tell me I only had one sentence, so I have a story to tell. When my daughter was married, I insinuated myself into the ceremony as father of the bride. I claimed some time. My wife says that at weddings I want to be the bride, and at funerals I want to be the corpse. But I did manage to say a word or two at her wedding. And what I told the bride and groom, my daughter, as I said, if you find God in your lives, you will find them in one another, in the love you have for one another, and for the love you have for the children that you will bring into this world. For me, the Christian imagination is the ability, the grace, I would say, to find God in all things, as the Jesuits put it. Christ plays in 10,000 places. Let us pray we have the grace to see him at work.
Well, thank you. Can I open it up to the audience to ask questions on any of those? Yes, please. The microphone's coming.
I was just left wanting to hear a little bit more about the key word in the title, which is imagination. because it's been implied in all the talks. But I would just like to hear a bit more about why you think the imagination is important. Because, I mean, if we go back to the time of Michael's specialty, Shakespeare was not very kind about the imagination, wasn't he? Do you remember that famous quote, the lover and the lunatic and the madman of imagination all compact? So it was a great source of anxiety because it had become the mediating force between the senses and the intelligence. And somehow it had to be under control. But nowadays we think that it's a great absence, that people don't exercise their imagination so much. But we don't really, I didn't get a sense that we were talking about the imagination. We're talking much more about creativity, engagement with creation, sacramentality. But why, I'd like to hear why you think the imagination is important.
Who's going to have a go at that?
Well, I had a different version, so you can take this or leave it. But what I wanted to say was the grace to see God's presence in the world and the imagination to create the metaphors that would make palpable or intelligible to others, or at least understandable to others, that vision, that sense of presence. So I think, for me, the imagination comes into play in the creativity that reflects the vision, or that the creativity that makes visible the vision.
Rowan?
Some of us were talking earlier about Ian McGilchrist's extraordinary work, The Master and His Emissary, and the more recent enormous 2-volume study about the functions of the different hemispheres of the brain. And one of the things I took from McGilchrist's work is the sense that there's a part of our thinking process which is essentially about a slightly risk-taking making of connections. Instead of just seeing things as mechanically following on, there is a capacity in us to take a bit of a leap of faith in joining things up and how they're understood. Now that shows itself in different ways. It shows itself in the brilliantly intuitive scientific theory. It shows itself in the artist's sense of what a work might be or look like. It shows itself in the metaphor in poetry, where suddenly two very different things act upon each other. And my own definition of imagination, for what it's worth, is that it's something to do with that capacity of taking the risk of connecting. And if McGilchrist is right, we've produced a culture in which people have quite widely forgotten how to do that, where we are so granular in our attention to the world around us that we're becoming less and less capable of making the connections that allow us to go on living intelligently. So imagination and intelligence do belong together very, very deeply. But the importance of imagination is that is what I call the risk-taking bit of it, which joins up somewhere.
Joe?
If I might jump on that, I think this idea of making connections, and you can kind of go back in the history of understanding of it, Kant, Schelling, is it Schelling or Schiller? Schelling, and the Einbildungskraft, which Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria takes to be, it's a mistaken calque of that, as if you are building into one thing. But he says the capacity of the imagination that we always engage in when we just have images of family members and when we think, but that the artist's particular goal in the secondary imagination is, he says, as in plastic, it's building all things into one. So taking these disparate elements of life, memories of going to mass, for example, or hearing somebody, the organ that's wheezing, and being able to shape those into a new reality so that the imagination has a productive capacity, not just recollection. And I think that's where the production element of the creation, the creativity element comes in. So I would carry that through, that the capacity to make those connections and to draw things into one, as in one poem, one film, one piece of literature that has a wholeness to it, a feeling of completion. So But thank you for pointing that out. I suppose we just sort of took that for granted.
Bonnie,
Yeah, I would add, and in a similar thought, I think that obviously the imagination is a fundamental instinct of all humans from the moment that they're able to imagine, and that we require stories to be told to us so that we can exercise our imagination. And we require to write stories for other people for the same reason. But I think there's something particular about the mysteries that Christians are asked to believe in, which are quite unique and challenging to Christianity. And we're asked or invited to think about our capacities when we meet the mysteries as being those of faith and reason. But in my own experience, I've often found it was really only with my imagination that I could even begin to consider some of those mysteries. And there is something crucial to that part of our faith that needs us to think in that way to even begin to see how it might be possible.
I spent an entire doctoral dissertation writing just on that topic of what is the imagination in theology, so I'll keep it short. But in one of Richard Carney's books, The Wake of Imagination, where he tries to sum up the entire history of Western philosophy on the imagination, I found he had a wonderful translation of Plato's term pharmakon to designate the imagination, both a poison and a potion in the sense of medicine. So it can, if in high doses, it can kill you, but in the right dose, it's going to be exactly what you need at that given moment. And I think one of the traits of the Christian imagination is that it reconciles opposites. And I think that was obvious in some of the things you were saying, but Nicholas of Cusa, for instance, has things on that, with the coincidentia oppositorum or reconciliatio oppositorum, that I think define the Christian imagination. We heard Ephesians 2 earlier today, that I think taps into it. And only the imagination can do that of bridging between God and man, infinite and finitude, etc. Sorry, more a comment than a question, I guess.
Can I go back just for a moment to Shakespeare? You have to remember that in the next speech, the woman, Hippolyta, corrects him and tells him that the intuitive and imaginative and kind of metaphoric way of knowing is a legitimate path into the truth. So it's just, I always read that as, the man is rational, and the woman has to remind him there's another way of knowing.
See, it's Theseus who uses the word imagination. He calls it voice, like a play.
When all their stories told together yields, I'm paraphrasing, something of great constancy. Yeah.
Today, various remarks have been made about, let's say, for example, some of the challenges for the Christian literary imagination in a society in which there's less religious practice, the religious communities are smaller, and so on. There's something that strikes me about the Christian literary imagination, which is about a sense of metaphysical depth, and quite a lot of movements within literature and within philosophy itself are often trying to undercut a confidence in, let's call it metaphysical depth, without actually having to specify exactly what that metaphysical depth is. But there's a confidence that there is some kind of metaphysically deep substrate. And I wonder if part of what's going on with the Christian literary imagination is that there is a playing around with this idea, that there's a playing around with some sense of confidence that there could be that metaphysical depth, whatever that exactly might be. And there at least that element, it seems to me, that question of metaphysical depth is very much in play. And I'd be very interested to hear what the panel would have to say about that sort of topic. Thank you.
Anybody volunteering to go first on that?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
I think that's right, John. I think the idea that you're playing around with ideas and you don't necessarily have to have an answer. but it's the playing around with the ideas that actually, and the performance of the imagination, which is the important bit. And depending on who the writer is, it could be in sure and certain hope. But actually, what's important is actually that you're making the endeavour. It's we're back to Eliot again, aren't we? The rest is, for us it's only the trying. But I think that's part of it. I think that's right. The expectation that there is that depth, and you'll get something from playing with it.
It adds another layer to whatever you're interpreting. So like my experience of listening to Julia's paper and thinking through what she had to say in terms of the writing process gave that writing process, I mean, that's something I'm kind of reading, as a object almost. It gave the writing process greater depth, right? And I think we're just compelled in our Western culture to read, to see literature through the lens of the Christian imagination, whether we are Christian or not Christian, right? Because of the prevalence of these really powerful stories. So I think you're right. It's always going to add not just, one layer, but multiple layers to whatever you're considering.
Thank you very much. I suppose the question would be, to what extent is our Christian literary imagination a reimagination? Near the beginning, or rather in an introductory letter to his exposition on the Orthodox faith, St. John Damascene says that proudly he claims to write nothing original because he supposedly posits his work as yet another seal of the fathers of orthodoxy. I was reminded of this when listening to Archbishop Rowan's talk. I noted some resonances with Hopkins and in Vaughan. For example, that line from Corruption, that felled him, foiled them all. Hopkins in several places mentions the word felled, notably in Binzie Poplars, felled, all felled. And his play of the repetition of vowels and consonants also manifests itself throughout his corpus, notably, for example, in As Kingfishers Catch Fire, Dragonflies Draw Flame. I suppose the poetic corpus of the Christian literary imagination sees itself as something that projects not only backwards, for example, from Vaughan to Herbert, but also forwards, insofar as there is causation and not merely correlation between people like Vaughan and Hopkins. So to what extent, if there is any relation between imagination and reimagination? Thank you.
I suppose one of the things that any artist knows is that the line between imagining and reimagining is a very, very shaky one, because you are always, in some important measure, rethinking what's been thought. You discover at all sorts of points in the process that connections you thought you had discovered have already been explored, and that's good. You can then move on. And the old chestnut about, I think was it Eliot who said, people say we know so much more than our predecessors. Precisely, said Eliot, and they are what we know. And that, to me, that crystallizes something that's going on in this reimagining process. So a poet who has carved out a very distinctive idiom and line and set of connections can be taken up by another poet and built upon. Not imitatively necessarily, not with any direct causal relationship, but this is the text you are now reworking, glossing, translating, and that goes on. Yeah, I think John Damascene was right. You don't have to be original all the time. But being imaginative and being original in the rather limited modern sense are not the same thing.
Any other comments on that? There was other hands up. At the back there, first, please.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting day. I just thought, since you're reflecting upon the Christian literary imagination, whether you would like to give us some reflections upon the pagan literary imagination, or perhaps what might be in the process of replacing the literary imagination of a Christian civilization, which seems to be, in some respects, on the way out. What's going to take over? What's in the process of taking over in the literary imagination?
Well, you're making me think of what was said about Flannery O'Connor, right? That when there's a question of sort of negative space, when you look at a world without the Christian literary imagination, you see in relief what's missing and what's lost, right? So I don't necessarily, I mean, what will take its place? Other stories, I guess, eventually, but for now, I think those narratives are pretty powerful. It doesn't mean you believe in them literally, but we've been raised on those narratives, even if we weren't raised Christian. They're everywhere around us, practically inescapable. And I think they kind of drive the way we think about ideas, imagination, creativity.
And I'm not sure if this is relevant to the question exactly, but thinking back to experience of reading lots and lots of novels for a literary prize a couple of years ago, my sense was that one of the real imaginative foci of this generation of fiction writers and fabulists was the environmental crisis. There is, if you like, a myth emerging there, various myths, a family of narratives about environmental crisis, judgment, survival, etc. And I just wonder if that's one of the, in the way it's often used, one of the sort of replacement myths for the Christian narrative. I think the Christian narrative can cope with and include that story, but it's often marketed, I think, as a kind of alternative. I don't know, just thinking out loud.
Joe, did you?
I'm reminded of, there's a great Nigerian poet and writer, Ben Okri, who says that a people are as healthy or as sick as the stories they tell themselves. Sick stories can make a nation sick, but stories can also instill hope. And I take that as in the absence of the Christian vision, that doesn't go away. And again, to refer to William Lynch, who spent a time at Georgetown University, by the way, he says that we're trying to always navigate between a univocal and an equivocal imagination with an analogical imagination. So the univocal tendency goes towards totalizing of things, where it's sort of everything is flattened, differences are flattened, and that's where totalitarianism moves in. And that's where it moves into the ethical realm too, the outplaying of what happens when we lose that tension. But the equivocal imagination is that everything is different, people can't talk across difference, we're all just sort of disparate pods. And so I think that the goal of the Christian vision is always to maintain that analogy that recognizes similarity and difference, that kind of moderates, as Nicholas was saying, the finite in the infinite. And so I think it does come back to Okri's point about telling healthy stories. And, what we've been focusing on has been much of the Anglosphere and North Atlantic, but I think a lot of world literature might reanimate some of the imagination. And so I think going forward, looking to where are writers beyond just Europe, United States, England, Australia, to say where is their hope, where are their stories that kind of embody and articulate that Christian vision that might reignite our own hearts as Christians.
Sorry, I'm just going to add one more thought to this, which is that every year I teach this paper that's been on the Cambridge English Tripos forever, which is the tragedy paper, and it asks students what is an unreasonable thing to do, really, in 8 weeks to study tragedy from Greek drama, Greek tragic drama, through Shakespeare all the way up to the modern day, and to say something intelligent about it. And because we have to cover that amount of material, I often find in my own mind, while I'm talking with them, that I'm thinking about the Greek drama as a moment of God's revelation as it is emerging just before the incarnation. And there is so much there that seems to be pointing towards a vision that is to come. And I suppose if we look at all of written literary time, then there's an awful lot of what you're saying is a pagan imagination, and rather less of what we would consider to be products of the Christian imagination. And I don't think that that needs to be alarming, because I think revelation can be located in most acts of creation, even if it is, as you said, in the absences. Even if we read something and feel that it has hit an odd note or a difficult note, or has lacked the thing that we see ought to be there, that's still something that speaks to our Christian imagination, and is a good in some way.
Yes, please.
Thank you all. It's been an amazing conference. I just wanted to share that I'm really passionate about the imagination and about the Christian imagination, and so I've loved these days. And maybe taking up a bit of what Joe was saying a few minutes ago, I think there's something very powerful about human imagination in general, but specifically in the Christian imagination, and it has to do with this ability to sort of weave things that are usually not woven together, and sometimes we see them as very distinct or irreconcilable. And I would love to ask a question. It might be a challenge, and that would be, do you think, any of you, do you see specific resources within your fields, within your ways of understanding or approaching the imagination, that might contribute not only within the realm of literature or the arts, and maybe through that onto other aspects of human life, say peace building? I say that clearly because I'm really interested in peace building, conflict resolution, reconciliation, and I think the role of imagination there is key and vital. So if there's anything that you see clearly from your experience or from your work within the imagination that might be useful as a resource, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Anybody?
Well,
Claire.
I think one of the things we've been thinking about a lot over the past couple of days is the number of different points of view that are going on at the same time. And I think one of the things which, thinking about your area, particularly the question about peace building, that's important is seeing, or we're back to the idea of connections and intersections, where people can have different viewpoints, but there are always intersections and connections. I think that's valuable, whatever walk of life you are, whether you're a peace building or a scientist or whatever you are, those idea of connections are absolutely vital. I think of all the talks we've been thinking about, whether it's been historical connections or connections with your own work and revisions or whatever it is, the idea of finding a connection and being distinct and allowing other people to have distinctive voices and distinctive imaginations, but finding an area of consolidation and of where you're alike, or even just accepting that you're not going to be alike, but just allowing the possibility and the space to do that. I think that's important, no matter what field you're in.
If I might.
I'm going to take, sorry, I'm just going to take one last one, which is here, down here. So,
Can I just also respond?
yes, please, yeah.
So when I think of our students at Georgetown and those in peace and justice studies, and in different environmental initiatives, and then you see how they respond to something like Laudato Si, and they get all excited. And the student who had been very anti-Christian, anti-norm, anti-religion, she said, "This is what Catholics believe?" And she came alive, and it became, in that sense, a resource for her in how he, of course, brilliantly pulls the science and the spirituality and this call for this conversion. And so I see how that can be a resource for our students as they take it forward into the future, addressing the environmental thing, but also peace building. It's a similar thing with peace and justice. They see suddenly what this tradition, what this worldview, what these possibilities have to offer, where they might not have. they still have to take to theology, but, you know, they, so in terms of resources for them and for our future peace builders.
Lightning comment, if I may. The world of drama. There's a huge amount happening in that world which relates to this. I'm thinking of the work done by the Good Chance Theatre Company with migrants from Calais.
Yeah.
A number of other groups like that for whom drama is, in some sense, a deeply sacred activity, very much connected with reconciliation, so forth. A lot of that going on.
Mike, you wanted to say?
For many years, I taught a summer course for students from almost literally all over the world. But we had students from the Balkans in the 90s, we had Palestinians, Israelis, so many from the troubled spots of the world, and we used as kind of a neutral troubled spot, Northern Ireland. And the whole idea was to get the students finally to know Seamus Heaney's Nobel Prize lecture. And what he, after reflecting on the troubles and so on, he ends up by saying we must make space in our reckoning for the marvelous as well as for the murderous. Our reckoning and imagine, he says, for the marvelous as well as the murderous. And it was an exercise to try to, now we might have had an audience that, you know, students had some optimism or they wouldn't have come to the program, but we began with the premise, unless you have some sense of possibility, you know, if you don't make space in your imagination for the marvelous, you know, peace in Northern Ireland, then you might as well go home. And that I found that sort of lecture and context helpful. The students seemed to make sense to them.
I said one more, and
Thank you. See if I can get this out. I think in responding to the challenge that the organizers made on using imagination in the context is finding the courage to embrace the reality, I think, that we are created in God's image. And in that light, I think Jung, I think it's Carl, was tentatively touching upon these aspects when he talked about collective unconscious. And I think, then extrapolating from that observation and ones we all think about, is that music, art, culture, literature is I think it is a language which we collectively hold in safe custody, the better angel of our nature, relating to that reality that we are an embodiment of God's creation. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does everyone agree with that? Yeah. Well, I think that's a lovely moment to draw the panel to a close. And if you'd like to go back into the audience, and I'll invite Jack DeGioia to close the conference. Can I thank you all very much indeed?
I've had some unenviable tasks in my years, and having the last word today is about the most unenviable. This has been such an extraordinary experience to be a part of this program, and I'm just so honored to have been able to spend this day and to be present for the presentations that we all heard and for the conversations that have unfolded. I will offer just some very brief closing words, and three words will shape it: gratitude, imagination, and discernment. First, gratitude, of course, for all that we've been able to experience. I think you'll see the appreciation work its way through a few of the reflections that I'll offer. In our time together today, we have celebrated and recognized and in many ways expressed our gratitude for the gifts that so many of our colleagues have shared with us. And to be in their presence and to be the recipient of these gifts has been profound. earlier I mentioned my years at Georgetown, and it's going on to quite some time. And in that context, I've been able to experience the arc of the availability of a set of resources that emerged as a result of a challenge of the Second Vatican Council to all of the Catholic orders to go back to their founding, to look to see how they could reimagine, make available in new ways their founding charism. And I remember when certain resources began to be available in our community in ways that were new. The most important for a place like Georgetown was the availability of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And in the mid-1980s, I remember attending a retreat that was designed for lay people who were involved in different kinds of leadership roles at Jesuit colleges and universities. We were kind of the first wave of lay people in these roles. And I was the dean of students at the university. I got invited, and I was exposed to a couple of Jesuits who were sharing with us some insights that I know I had been looking to understand what it meant for me. At that point, I had already been at the university 10 years, and I had been looking around for what does it mean? What does it mean to be in this place? And I remember coming out of that retreat, and these were two giants among the Jesuits. I had never heard of them until I had gone to that retreat. They became very important people in my life in the years that followed. But in that moment, we were being exposed to some resources that were new. And I remember coming back to campus and finding a Jesuit in our community who I was very close to. And I said, "Why didn't you tell me any of this stuff?" And his response was, "We're just learning how." And that was about, roughly 40 years ago. We're just learning how. It was that work that began in the late 1960s, and a whole generation of Jesuits. And Julia mentioned one of them, John O'Malley, who served in our community for the last 15 years of his life. There were others who were part of a generation that just made available these resources. And so for me, in the late 80s, after that experience, I sought out direction, which is the best way of describing what it means to embrace or engage the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And I found a director, and we started meeting, and we met weekly for roughly the next decade of my life. And it was new in some respects for him too, to direct someone like me. And the way we structured it is we met every Friday morning, and each week he'd give me, a set of reflections, reflections that I was to read and reflect upon in prayer, write up some notes, some assignments regarding Scripture. But the biggest time commitment that he imposed in his direction, he was quite clear. He said, "I am the director here, The third piece was, without fail, 30 minutes every day of reading fiction. And the purpose in this work of spiritual direction, the purpose was to enlarge the capacity of my imagination to make sense of what I was experiencing in prayer and in reading Scripture and in this conversation that I was having with God, overseen by this spiritual director. So the importance of imagination in my spiritual life was presented to me quite early, and by my director. And as I came to understand the role of imagination, sort of deep roots in the Ignatian tradition. I think Father Mark Bosco led us, there you are, Father Mark Bosco led our community last year in the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the conversion of St. Ignatius. And if you're not familiar with, for those of you who are familiar, please bear with me for a moment, because I just would summarize it briefly, because I think it's important to this conception of imagination. Ignatius was a young courtier, and he was injured in an impossible battle in Pamplona, defending a stronghold that the French were attacking. And we came to understand that he was highly regarded for his courage and his bravery on the battlefield, and his opponents had so much respect for him, they carried him off the battlefield and brought him home. And in his autobiography, Ignatius shares with us what unfolded in his months of convalescence. These were the months of his conversion. Now remember, he was hit by a cannonball, and I try to imagine what it's like to be hit by a cannonball. But this was a moment where more than just his leg was shattered, his whole worldview was shattered. I would say that early in his convalescence, his self-identity was one. He took great. His chief delight was in the exercise. It was to be in battle, to seek honor, to seek glory, and he had to give that up. But it was not without trying. He in his convalescence, he asked for books that would feed his identity, requesting tales of chivalry. And with none to be found, he was limited to two books, A Life of Christ and a book of the lives of the saints. And we are the beneficiaries of what unfolded in his imagination and his interiority as he wrestled with what they meant to him. From that, ultimately, he developed the guidebook, the spiritual exercises for directors, like the one who guided me. And the handbook was originally intended for his closest colleagues and soon for the first members of his new religious order. And what he was engaged in in that work was this practice of discernment. And when he reflected on the reading of sacred literature, the life of Christ, the lives of the saints, and allowed his imagination to flow, the interior experience for him was one of what he called consolation. And when he reflected on the waves of the world, on his pursuit of glory and of power and of honor, the interior feeling was one of desolation. And he spent a good deal of time trying to help discern, what is it that enabled consolation? What is it that enabled or resulted in desolation? And again, he developed a practice that would enable himself and others to grasp sources of consolation, those that could lead to desolation. And the practice is called discernment. And in the spiritual exercises, he calls it the discernment of spirits. It's a guidebook for this practice. So what does this mean for us in this moment, in this reflection on the Christian literary imagination? What is discernment? Early in the interview, when asked by Father Antonio Spadaro, when he asked the Holy Father in that early interview that pretty much introduced Pope Francis to much of the world, he said, what does it mean for a Jesuit to be elected Pope? What element of Ignatian spirituality helps you to live your ministry? And Pope Francis responded with one word: discernment. And then he was asked by Father Spadaro a little bit more, and he said discernment is one of those things that worked inside St. Ignatius. For him, it's an instrument of struggle in order to know the Lord and to follow him more closely. And Father Nick Austin, who began our day today with his introductory comments, describes discernment as a simple but transformative practice, and describes Pope Francis as advocating for formation in discernment. Well, if we go back to the experience of St. Ignatius, of his conversion, it was a conversion informed by, animated by, enriched by a literary experience, a literary engagement with his imagination. And that's at the heart of what I think connects some of the elements of our time together. And it is, for me, it's just a privilege to be here. I can't begin to tell you how much it means to me to have this opportunity to be with all of you, share these brief reflections, but to have been present for an experience of consolation that will be with me for a long time to come. So thank you.